The wind was a blade against Elara Vance's skin, slicing through the fine silk of her ruined evening gown. Each rasp of the frozen pines sounded like the whispers of the men who hunted her, their baying hounds a phantom echo in the relentless gale. She was a creature of warm libraries and quiet drawing rooms, a woman defined by the soft cadence of poetry and the gentle guidance of a student's hand. But out here, in the unforgiving heart of the mountains, she was nothing more than prey. The last vestiges of warmth had long since fled her body, leaving a deep, aching cold that had settled in her bones, a cold that mirrored the ice of absolute despair in her soul. She stumbled, her satin slipper, a mockery of her former life, catching on a gnarled root hidden beneath the snow. The fall was not a sudden shock but a slow, surrendering collapse, her body too weary to fight gravity's pull. Lying in the deepening drift, the snow felt like a final, soft blanket. The darkness at the edge of her vision was not frightening. It was a quiet promise of peace, a release from the terror of Bartholomew Thorne, the man who believed he could own her spirit as easily as he owned his vast, empty tracts of land. Her last conscious thought was not of her pursuers, but of a single, defiant star winking through the canopy of thrashing branches, a tiny spark of light in an overwhelming darkness. Have you ever been pushed so far that the only thing left to do is surrender? Have you ever felt a loneliness so profound that the silence of the wilderness feels like a kinder companion than the company of men? This is a story for those who have known that brink. It is the story of a woman who was hunted until she had nothing left, and of the solitary man who found her. It is a story about the kind of love that does not blossom in sun-drenched gardens, but is forged in the heart of the longest, coldest winter, a love that proves that even in the deepest snow, a single ember of hope can be coaxed back into a roaring flame. He found her by chance, a splash of deep blue silk against the stark white canvas of the early morning snow. Silas Blackwood moved through the forest with the quiet confidence of a man who was more a part of it than a visitor. The land was in his blood, its harsh rhythms the only ones that had ever made sense to his wounded soul. He had been checking his trap lines, a ritual as ingrained as breathing, when the unnatural colors snagged his eye. He approached with caution, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. The mountains were full of dangers, but this was something different. She was small, almost childlike, curled in on herself as if to protect a final, flickering spark of life. Her face, framed by strands of dark hair caked with snow, was pale as alabaster, her lips the color of a winter twilight. He could see the terror etched into her features even in unconsciousness, a deep, primal fear that his own heart recognized. Silas had built his life on a foundation of solitude, each log of his cabin a barrier against a world that had taken everything from him. He had buried his wife and child years ago, and with them he had buried the man he used to be. The man who was left wanted nothing to do with the troubles of others. Yet, as he looked down at the fragile woman at his feet, a forgotten instinct stirred within him. It was the echo of the protector he had once been, a whisper of the honor that the war and his grief had failed to completely extinguish. To leave her would be to condemn her to death, a passive cruelty his spirit would not abide. With a sigh that plumed in the frigid air, a sound of weary resignation, he knelt. Gently, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against the hard muscle of his chest. As he carried her back toward the wisp of smoke that marked his isolated home, he did not know that he was carrying not just a stranger, but the first fragile seed of his own redemption. The cabin was his fortress against memory, but for her, it would become his sanctuary. Elara awoke to the scent of wood smoke and pine, a gentle warmth seeping into her frozen limbs. For a moment, she drifted in a soft, painless haze, a welcome respite from the nightmare she had been living. Then, memory returned with the force of a physical blow. The chase, the cold, the fall. Her eyes flew open, wide with panic. The ceiling above her was made of rough-hewn logs, dark and solid. A thick fur blanket covered her. She was in a bed, a simple cot in the corner of a small one-room cabin. And standing by the stone hearth, his broad back to her, was a man. He was large, a silhouette of intimidating size against the dancing flames, and her heart hammered against her ribs. Had they found her? Was this just another cage, a different kind of prison from the one Thorn had locked her in? The man turned, and her breath caught in her throat. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and old scars, a long-ago story of violence written on his skin. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found hers. There was no malice in them, no cruel triumph she had come to expect from her captors. There was only a quiet, weary watchfulness. He moved toward the bed and she flinched, pulling the fur tighter around her. He stopped instantly, holding up a hand as if to soothe a frightened animal. He said nothing, simply retreated to the hearth and returned with a wooden bowl of steaming broth. He set it on a small crate beside the cot, his movements deliberate and slow. "Eat," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. It was not a command, but a simple statement of fact. She stared at the bowl, then back at him. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Silas Blackwood," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "You're safe here." The words were so simple, yet they felt like a foreign language. Safety was a concept she had forgotten. "Why?" she asked, the question tearing from her raw throat. "Why are you helping me?" He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his serious eyes. "Because this is my land," he said, after a long moment of silence. "And no one deserves to die in the snow on it." It was not the answer she expected, but it held a strange, irrefutable logic. He did not ask her name, nor where she came from. He simply gave her shelter and space, a quiet dignity she had been denied for so long. In the silent cabin, with the blizzard now raging outside, Ilara took her first sip of the warm broth, a fragile truce declared between her fear and the stoic kindness of this wounded stranger. The blizzard became their accomplice, cocooning the small cabin in a world of white and forcing an intimacy that neither of them would have chosen. For days, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, piling snow against the door and frosting the single window pane with intricate, icy ferns. The world outside ceased to exist. Inside, a quiet rhythm began to form, dictated by the simple, pressing needs of survival. Silas would tend the fire, his large hands surprisingly deft as he split kindling. Ilara, her strength slowly returning, found purpose in small domestic acts. She swept the hearth, her movements reclaiming a piece of her own agency. She took the needle and thread Silas offered and began mending a tear in his canvas coat, the simple, repetitive motion a balm to her frayed nerves. They spoke little, but the silence was no longer heavy with fear. It became a shared space, a vessel for unspoken understanding. He would watch her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, his stormy eyes filled with a question he never asked. He saw the innate grace in her movements, the gentle set of her jaw that spoke of a resilience she was only just beginning to rediscover. She, in turn, saw past his forbidding exterior to the deep well of sorrow he carried. She saw it in the way he would stare into the fire for hours, his mind 1,000 miles away, and in the careful way he handled a small, carved wooden bird that sat on the mantelpiece, the only object in the cabin that was not purely practical. One evening, as the fire crackled and the storm outside seemed to pause to draw breath, she decided to fill the silence with her truth. "His name is Bartholomew Thorn," she began, her voice quiet but steady. Silas, who was sharpening his knife by the firelight, did not look up, but she felt the focus of his attention shift entirely to her. "I was a governess for his niece. He decided he wanted me. Not as a wife, not really. As a possession. Another beautiful thing to display in his cold, empty house." She told him of the polite refusals that escalated into threats, of the day he locked her in her room, telling her she would remain there until her childish defiance was broken. She spoke of the weeks of isolation, the fear, and the single, desperate chance she took to escape. As she spoke, the story poured out of her, a torrent of pain and humiliation that had been dammed up for too long. When she finished, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. It was a testament to her survival. Silas finally looked up from his blade. He set it down carefully on the hearth. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a profound and terrible understanding. He had known a helplessness like hers. "He will not find you here," Silas said, and it was not a reassurance but a solemn vow. In that moment, something shifted between them. The fragile truce blossomed into a tentative trust, a delicate root taking hold in the frozen ground of their shared solitude. When the blizzard finally broke, it left behind a world transformed, draped in a pristine blanket of white that sparkled under a newly confident sun. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger threat of Bartholomew Thorne loomed over Ilara's future like a distant mountain range, dark and menacing. She knew she could not stay in the cabin forever, and yet, the thought of leaving this small pocket of safety was terrifying. The world beyond this clearing was Thorne's world, a place where his money and influence could twist truth into lies and paint her as a madwoman or a thief. She had nowhere to go. When she tried to express her gratitude and speak of leaving, Silas cut her off with a single, gruff statement. "The passes won't be clear for weeks. You're staying." It was not a debate. The finality in his tone was not that of a captor, but of a protector stating an undeniable fact. And so, her stay extended from days into weeks. Silas seemed to understand that for her to truly heal, she needed more than just safety, she needed strength. He began to teach her the ways of his world. He started with the basics, showing her how to set a snare, how to identify edible plants peeking through the snow, how to read the subtle language of the forest. Then, one crisp morning, he pressed a small, lightweight rifle into her hands. It was heavy and foreign, a tool of violence that made her flinch. "Fear is his weapon," Silas told her, his voice low as he adjusted her stance. "You will not beat him with fear. You will beat him with this." He was a patient teacher, his instructions sparse but clear. He taught her how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching, how to respect the power she held. When she finally hit the tin can he had set on a distant stump, a small, triumphant sound in the vast silence of the woods, a rare, faint smile touched his lips. It transformed his harsh features, revealing a glimpse of the man he had been before grief had carved its lines upon his face. They fell into a rhythm that was almost domestic. They worked side by side, preparing meals, chopping wood, maintaining the small fortress against the wilderness. The cabin, once a monument to his isolation and loss, began to fill with new life. The scent of baking bread, from a recipe she remembered from her childhood, mingled with the familiar smell of wood smoke. Her quiet humming as she worked was a sound he hadn't realized he had missed so desperately. The slow burn of their connection was not in words, but in shared glances across the dinner table, in the way he would place a steaming mug of tea by her side as she read one of his few worn books, in the way she would patch his coat with stitches that were both neat and strong. He was giving her the tools to become her own hero, and in doing so, she was unknowingly rebuilding the home within his heart. The tendrils of Bartholomew Thorne's influence were long and insidious, reaching even into the remote corners of the frontier. He was not a man to accept defeat, especially at the hands of a woman he considered his property. In the nearest town, a settlement Silas visited only when absolutely necessary, new posters had been plastered on every available surface. They bore a charcoal sketch of Ilara's face, a passable likeness, beneath a bold headline, "Reward." The text described the disappearance of Miss Ilara Vance, the beloved and tragically unwell fiancée of Mr. Bartholomew Thorne, who, in a fit of melancholy, had wandered into the wilderness. It was a masterful piece of cruelty, painting her as a fragile, unstable creature in need of rescue and return to her rightful keeper. Silas saw the poster on the wall of the general store while trading furs for flour and salt. The sight of it hit him like a physical blow, a cold dread seeping into his veins. The sanctuary he had built was not as impenetrable as he had believed. The world, with all its greed and lies, was clawing at his door. He bought his supplies with a grim silence, his face a thunderous mask that discouraged any attempts at conversation from the storekeeper. The ride back to the cabin was a blur of righteous fury and cold calculation. The quiet peace he and Ilara had cultivated was a fragile thing, a glass house he now realized he had built in the path of a hurricane. He had allowed himself to hope, to imagine a future that wasn't defined by the ghosts of his past. Now, that future was threatened by the ghost of her past. He found her tending to a small herb garden she had insisted on planting in a sunny patch near the cabin, a small act of faith in the coming spring. She looked up and smiled as he approached, a genuine, radiant smile that had become increasingly common. The sight of it twisted the knife of his fear. How could he tell her that the monster she had fled was now actively hunting her? That her face was known? He dismounted, his movements heavy with the news he carried. He didn't soften the blow. He simply pulled the folded poster from his coat and handed it to her. She read it, her face draining of all color, the life and light in her eyes extinguished as if by a sudden gust of wind. The fragile piece was not just shattered, it was annihilated, and in its place, a tense, cold silence descended upon the small cabin in the woods. The storm had found them. Ilara's first reaction was a wave of icy terror, the familiar, paralyzing fear she thought she had begun to conquer. Her hands trembled as she held the poster, Thorn's lies staring back at her in stark black ink. Her instinct was to run, to flee again into the wilderness, but the impulse died as quickly as it came. She looked up from the paper and met Silas's gaze. In his eyes, she saw not fear, but a grim, unshakable resolve. He was not a man who ran. Over the past weeks, he had shown her how to be strong, how to stand her ground. To run now would be to betray everything he had taught her, everything she had learned about herself. A new feeling, hot and defiant, burned away the cold of her fear. She straightened her shoulders and handed the poster back to him. "He thinks I am still that frightened girl who fled his house," she said, her voice low but clear, without a trace of its earlier tremor. "He is wrong." She walked into the cabin and returned with the rifle he had given her, checking the action with a practiced motion. "You taught me how to face the wolves in the forest, Silas. I will not run from this one." A flicker of something, pride, admiration, warmed his stormy eyes. They did not have to wait long. A few days later, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows through the pines, the sound of approaching horses broke the evening stillness. Silas had been expecting them. He had spent the intervening days fortifying the cabin, reinforcing the door, and mapping out fields of fire from the two small windows. He and Ilara moved with a quiet, synchronized purpose. He took his position at the front window, his heavy Sharps rifle resting on the sill. She took the smaller window at the back, her rifle ready. The riders emerged from the trees, 5 of them, led by Bartholomew Thorn himself. He sat atop a magnificent black stallion, dressed in fine city clothes that were absurdly out of place in the rugged wilderness. He looked at the humble cabin with an expression of contemptuous ownership. "Blackwood," he boomed, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I know she is in there. Send out the woman. She is my property, and I have come to collect what is mine." Silas's reply was not a word, but an action. A single shot from his rifle splintered the tree trunk just inches from Thorn's head. The resounding crack echoed through the mountains like a clap of thunder. Thorn's horse reared, and he struggled to control it, his face contorted in a mask of fury and surprise. "So be it, you savage," he shrieked, his voice losing its controlled condescension. "Take the cabin. I want him dead and her alive." The men dismounted, spreading out to surround the small structure, taking cover behind trees. The first shot from one of the hired guns pinged off the stone of the hearth. The siege had begun. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and tension. But there was no panic. There was only the grim determination of 2 people fighting for their home, their future, and their right to exist free from the tyranny of a cruel and possessive man. In a fit of rage, he dismounted and grabbed a rifle from one of his cowering men. "Useless curs," he spat. "I'll do it myself." He stormed toward the cabin, firing wildly, his movements clumsy and reckless, driven by ego rather than strategy. This was the moment Silas had been waiting for. He didn't fire from the window. Instead, he kicked open the heavy plank door and stepped out into the twilight to meet his enemy head-on. The duel was no longer one of rifles, but of wills. Thorn, momentarily stunned by Silas's audacity, raised his rifle. But Silas was faster, his movements fluid and economical. He closed the distance, deflecting Thorn's weapon and sending it flying. The fight became primal. Thorn was bigger, fueled by a lifetime of indulgence and fury, but Silas was harder, stronger, his body honed by years of labor and survival. It was a clash of two opposing forces, the loud, entitled greed of Thorn against the quiet, unyielding honor of Silas. Silas fought not with hatred, but with a cold, clear purpose. He was defending more than his life. He was defending his home, the woman who had brought light back into it, and the fragile hope for a future he had dared to believe in. He systematically dismantled Thorn's attack, his skill and discipline far outmatching the other man's brute force. In the end, he did not kill him. He left him broken and humiliated in the dirt, his fine clothes torn, his arrogant face bruised and swollen with defeat. The remaining hired guns, seeing their master so utterly vanquished, faded back into the forest like the cowards they were. The threat was over. In the quiet aftermath, the air was still and cold, cleansed by the violence. The scent of gunpowder faded, replaced by the familiar smell of pine and damp earth. Silas stood over the defeated form of Bartholomew Thorn, his chest heaving, not from exertion, but from the sheer emotional weight of the battle he had just won. He did not grant the man the dignity of a final, fatal blow. Instead, he bound him securely, a task he performed with an impersonal efficiency. Thorn's power, built on wealth and fear, had proven to be a hollow thing when faced with a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Ilara emerged from the cabin, her rifle held loosely at her side. She looked at the pathetic figure of her former tormentor, and felt not hatred or triumph, but a profound sense of release. The specter that had haunted her for so long was now just a man, pathetic and powerless, stripped of his authority. They left him and his wounded men for the law. Silas rode to town the next morning and returned with the sheriff, a weary but honest man who knew of Silas Blackwood's reputation. Ilara's testimony, delivered with a quiet strength and corroborated by the evidence of the siege, was all that was needed. Her name was cleared, the lies on the poster replaced by the truth of her ordeal. The law would deal with Thorn. Back at the cabin, a new kind of silence fell between them, one no longer defined by shared solitude, but by a shared future. They stood on the small porch, watching the last rays of sun paint the western sky in hues of orange and purple. The world felt vast and full of possibility. "I owe you my life, Silas," Ilara said softly, her eyes on the horizon. He turned to her, his scarred face softened by the twilight. "You owe me nothing, Ilara," he said, his voice imbued with a gentle gravity she had never heard before. "You brought life back to this place. Back to me." He hesitated, the next words feeling foreign on his tongue after years of disuse. "This cabin, this land, it was my prison. You made it a home again." He took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. "It is your home now. If you'll have it." Ilara looked from his earnest, hopeful face to the small, sturdy cabin, then to the vast, beautiful wilderness that she no longer feared. She had found her sanctuary, her strength, and her heart, all in this one place, with this one man. "I'll have it," she whispered, her answer a promise. A year later, the cabin had a small, neat addition. The scent of wildflowers from Ilara's garden mingled with the smell of baking bread. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the clearing, two young orphans from the town, whom Ilara and Silas had taken in. She was teaching them to read on the porch, her voice a gentle murmur against the backdrop of the forest. Silas stood by the corral, mending a fence, but his gaze was on the scene before him. He watched the woman he loved and the children who called him father, and the ghosts of his past, the sorrow that had been his only companion for so long, finally dissolved into the warm sunlight. He was no longer the stoic protector, but a husband and a father. She was no longer the resilient survivor, but a creator of love and a beacon of hope. They had found their family, not by blood, but by a bond forged in the fiercest of storms. We have come to the end of their beginning. We have witnessed how a woman, hunted and stripped of everything, found the strength not only to survive, but to build a new life from the ashes of her old one. We have seen how a man, walled off from the world by a grief so profound it had become his very identity, learned to tear down those walls, brick by painful brick, to let the light back in. Ilara and Silas did not just find safety in one another's arms, they found salvation. They remind us that the deepest wounds are not healed by time alone, but by the quiet, courageous act of opening our hearts to another. Their love story was not written in whispered sonnets or grand declarations, but in shared chores, patient teaching, and the silent, unshakable promise to stand together against the darkness. It is a testament to the fact that a home is not four walls, but the presence of a soul who sees you, protects you, and chooses to walk beside you, no matter how harsh the terrain. So I ask you, what storms are you facing in your own life? And is there a flicker of hope, however small, that you are protecting from the wind? Perhaps the sanctuary you seek is not a place to hide, but a person to stand with. If the story of Silas and Ilara's journey from despair to devotion has touched your heart, please share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Your story matters too. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales of love's enduring power to heal, to redeem, and to build a happily ever after in the most unexpected of places.